Have all three, all right, we're recording it. Have you guys been able to hear most of the morning or just dropping in for this section? Looks like most of you have seen the morning. Good. It's helpful to hear the public comments in particular, I think, in addition to the rest, it's just helpful as a platform for where we're starting from. Okay, Annetta and Barry. Oh, there's Barry, great. So Annetta's the only one who's not on camera. We'll start again in just a few seconds. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started again? All right, welcome back for the Policy Roundtable section of our day. There's Annetta back. We've got all of our Policy Roundtable participants, many of which have been with us for the earlier part of the day. But I'd like to invite those who were not part of this group to introduce themselves if they don't mind. So we can see Dr. Cohen, we've had him already. So why don't we go with David Dohan first.
Hi, I'm Dr. David Dohan. I'm the medical director for pharmacy at Point 32 Health, which is a large not-for-profit healthcare insurance company in New England, combination of Tufts Health Plan and Harvard Pilgrim. And I also work part-time at Leahy as a primary care doctor, very part-time.
Great, thanks for joining us. All right, Lauren was with us this morning, and Annetta. William or Will, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. Will Rose. I'm the Executive Director of Access Marketing and Health Economics and Outcomes Research here at TG Therapeutics. We're a biotech company and the manufacturer of ublituximab, which has been discussed earlier today, now known as Briumvi commercially. So pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invite.
Well, thank you. And it's always fortunate when FDA approval happens before these public roundtables, because it just gives you a little bit more of a degree of freedom to say things. I know how that goes. So thank you for signing up.
It would have been a lot quieter otherwise, yes.
Yep, I know how that goes. Okay, and we know Barry and Daniel Uding.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So hello, everyone. I'm Dan Uding, clinical pharmacist here on the utilization management team at Prime Therapeutics, working to develop different drug strategies, ensuring our members receive safe, clinically appropriate, cost-effective medications. Just a really brief background on Prime Therapeutics. We're owned by 19 nonprofit Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. I probably will be sharing some different trend numbers that we're seeing, and those trend numbers are just associated with our commercial book of business from 2022, where we had about 16 million commercial members, 1.5 million Medicare, and then about 1.3 million Medicaid. So we're excited with, you may have heard Prime's recent acquisition of Magellan RX, still working on integration and processes there. So the numbers I'm sharing today, just want to be sure everyone's aware, those are from Prime's book of business in 2022. So really looking forward. I mean, it's been great to hear the discussion so far this day, earlier today. As far as our unique relationship with our Blues partners, we're really able to look at that medical and pharmacy integration. And I think that's especially important. And we'll take a look at some of the trend and spend today, as well as we talk about agents, that are paid for on both the pharmacy and medical side. So really great to meet everyone. Appreciate the opportunity and really looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks. Okay, great. You can take down this slide then, help us see each other a little bit better. The way I've generally thought of structuring the hour and a half that we have would be to talk first broadly about kind of the coverage landscape and the utilization landscape. Our job is to try to hear different perspectives, frame important questions for policymakers, but also to, where we can, try to create some ideas around what you could call best practices, or at least, approaches to doing it better going forward. Then we'll talk a little bit more granular, in a more granular fashion, about the prior authorization that is likely to attend a new entrant into the MS kind of category like ublituximab. We'll round out by talking about pricing and payment options and future research. So if you think you're just chomping at the bit to talk about the price, it's coming. But I just want to kind of take us through a flow like that to the extent that it works. We can always go in different directions. But I would like to start with Barry and or Lauren, but Barry in particular, perhaps because I did look back, it was 6 years ago by the calendar, 2017, when we did our first MS review. And if I had to ask you, is the world any better for patients with MS since 2017 and all the ways that you care about? What would you say?
The short answer would be yes. More treatments provide more opportunities for people. And I think there's a growing body of evidence around the need for high efficacy treatments. And so that's important information. The Inflation Reduction Act has been a big benefit for people with MS. They won't see those benefits for most of the out-of-pocket costs for a couple of years now, but it holds that promise for people that they'll be able to afford their medications in Medicare, and it allows people to financially plan differently today as they're looking ahead to when they'll be on Medicare. But there are still substantial problems in the private insurance market. Do you think also in the last year we've seen Mark Cuban's Cost Plus as a disruptor in the healthcare system? So that has pros and cons. They do have generics for one of the MS DMTs, and they are serving people with MS in that way, which is a great option, but it means that the best option for people is to go outside of their health insurance and healthcare system. And I think we can all feel pretty bad that that's the best option that there is for people with MS.
All right, thanks. Lauren, anything you'd want to add? I mean, I don't remember when your diagnosis was first made, but it was at least 6 years ago, I think. So how do you feel like things have been going over that time period from a patient's perspective?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed 9 years ago in 2014. Dimethyl fumarate had just been introduced to the market, I believe, either that year or the year before. So there's definitely been a ton of progress since I've been diagnosed, especially with those monoclonal antibodies, most of which have come out post my diagnosis. As Barry said, there's definitely a lot of hope with the Inflation Reduction Act, but also, as I've mentioned before today with healthcare, there's definitely a mixed bag of issues that patients face and will face, along with inequity and with finding an actual cure, not just a disease modifying therapy.
Yeah, the hunt goes on for that. So Dan, I wonder, I hadn't thought of this, but since you mentioned it, maybe not over 6 years, but what, like if you had to give a state of the union from a PBM's perspective on the MS space, what does it look like in terms of trends, as you say?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So, I mean, with the emergence of Ocrevus, in 2017, limited drugs on the medical benefit prior to that, as far as spend goes. I mean, we took a look at what our spend looked like in 2022, again, commercial book of business, with those 16 million members. I mean, we're still, we've seen generics emerge with dimethyl fumarate, fingolimod, glatiramer, and then of course the Rituxan biosims emergence as well. So I think that's kind of helped level the cost a little bit, but I think we're still hovering around, when we think about trend and spend, we put it in that per member per month format, and we're still right around $6 or so, but around $3.50 on the pharmacy side, and then $2.50 on the medical side. So you're talking about all of a sudden we're at about 40%, spend on the medical benefit, which is much different than prior to the emergence of Ocrevus.
Good. And we will come back to the integrated benefit issue, how different plans and PBMs are handling that. So let me then turn to the clinical experts. Again, just taking the broad step back, ublituximab just having entered practice. How do you anticipate its role in therapy? What will we see around the US as how ublituximab is placed into that broader scheme of its role? Now, Annette, I know you represent in some ways the view of a very specific delivery system. And I don't know how much you know about how it will or likely be used outside of Kaiser, but why don't you go ahead and then I'll ask Bruce to comment too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're subject to the pressures of the marketplace, just like everybody else. So it's really not that special. and we are an independent medical group, so I don't work for a health plan. But I will say that it's all about pricing. So now you have ublituximab, which is very, very similar to Ocrevus. Every 6 months, it's got a much shorter infusion time. That is a big win, particularly as we start to think about potentially beta amyloid drugs coming to market and really, impacting infusion center access. So that 1 hour infusion time is a big deal. But I think ultimately, payers are going to go with whoever gives them the best price on that, whether they're able to negotiate a better contract with Ocrevus versus ublituximab. I don't think clinicians are going to have a big, I don't think there's any clinicians out there that actually believe there's some sort of difference between these two drugs. I will say in the fee-for-service world, that 1 hour infusion is a beautiful price point. It's not like you get paid 6 times as much for a 6 hour infusion. You get paid most of your reimbursement in that first hour. So that is, that's also for groups that have their own infusion centers, both private practices and university settings, there's a billing advantage as well.
Okay, Bruce, what would you say?
So first of all, I've been doing this for more than 35 years. And I'd like to say that in my observation, there's been a dramatic difference in how people are doing with MS today. And the first thing that somebody says to me when they get a diagnosis is they're thinking, when am I going to be in a wheelchair? And I can confidently tell them now that the likelihood of that is far less than it was years ago. And I think it's far less than it was even in 2017 with the advent of newer, more effective therapies. With respect to ublituximab, I don't have the luxury of prescribing rituximab because I can't get insurance coverage for it. And just parenthetically, many of my patients are Blue Cross Blue Shield patients, but I can't get it approved. So that option, that low cost option, is off the table for me. So a lot of this is going to be governed by access barriers that my patients encounter, and how I can get around those, or how much restriction that imposes. I will say something that hasn't come up today regarding ublituximab. Although, like the other monoclonals, it depletes B cells, it does so a little differently than the others. It's not the same molecule or exactly the same type of action that the others have. And that may be one of the reasons why the infusion reaction rate is higher in the ublituximab study than it is in the ocrelizumab studies. And so one of the questions that I think will only be clarified by post-marketing data is whether or not we're going to see occasional more severe infusion reactions with ublituximab than we do with ocrelizumab. But that's yet to be determined.
Okay.
All right. In addition, for what it's worth, and there are with all the caveats regarding comparing across studies, rates of serious infections were higher in the ublituximab study than they were in either the ofatumumab study or the ocrelizumab study. So I think that there are still open questions until the drug gets into widespread use about comparability regarding that aspect. With respect to effect on annualized relapse rates, I think it'll be comparable. Infusion timing, 1 hour versus 2 hours. Ocrelizumab is 2 hours, ublituximab is 1 hour. So I would strongly resist any effort to switch patients who are doing well on ocrelizumab or ofatumumab to ublituximab, because I think that potentially exposes them to side effects that they don't currently have without any benefit on outcome. On the other hand, I expect ublituximab to have a significant penetration regarding new starts.
All right, and you gave me lots of good leaders into further aspects of what we're going to talk about. So let me now turn to the payers, the plans, and the PBM. So you've heard the discussion this morning, and just again, you can talk more generally or more specifically to the extent you can. So ublituximab just approved a couple of weeks ago. How will it be viewed in terms of its role in therapy and the way you'll handle its integration into your coverage decision-making around tiering, around step therapy? I mean, we're going to get into some of these more specific issues later, but just as you see this now as newly approved by the FDA, what's your early take on how you think it'll be covered by insurance. Dan, why don't you go first?
Sure, thanks, Steve. So new FDA approval, this one is slated for our next P&T committee meeting, which is in February. So, they're the ones who really give us those clinical guardrails. They're the ones looking at safety, efficacy, uniqueness. So from there, depending on those clinical guardrails that the P&T gives us in February, that's where we have, a separate discussion at Prime's business committee meeting, and that's with our pharmacy directors, our Blues plans, and that's where we really look at cost effectiveness of the drugs, placement, prior authorization, utilization management from there. So really unable to give, real specifics at this time since it hasn't gone to February, but that's our plan to bring it through.
Okay. David, anything different you'd like to add?
In general, point 32 has not been doing PA for the monoclonals for multiple sclerosis. We did initially with the Ocrevus, and we had a very high approval rate. Data came out showing how effective it was. We removed it. Interestingly, we have it on Rituxan only because it's used for so many other indications, and that we need obviously a PA for that. In Rituxan, I hear other plans don't cover it. And generally, we would not have covered it except for in 2012 or whenever we added it. There was nothing else out there for a primary progressive. So we added it when Ocrevus came out. We said, God, looks very similar to Ocrevus. Why would we remove something that was significantly cheaper? And we've left it on our formulary. In terms of this drug, we'll wait to P&T and pricing. I think the fact that we haven't done much PA doesn't mean we won't do PA for something, but is a class of clinical concern for us that we really, again, I heard a comment earlier about health plans wanting people to miss their medications. I mean, we want people on their meds. We don't want them relapsing. We want to give them the best care possible. And again, PA does create some hazard for patients to get their medicines.
All right, so let me pose a question to you guys, the payers. Someone is the devil's advocate, obviously, but you've got a drug out there that these, a lot of clinicians in the US have been using. These wild-eyed clinicians at ICER and others have been using, Rituxan. It's $4,400 a year compared to all of the others, which are, 50s or above. And the evidence today was voted, basically that you can't really distinguish the effectiveness of the monoclonal antibodies, including the blituximab, from the others. Why aren't health plans, why aren't you guys doing the job to keep down overall premiums by driving patients and clinicians to the use of Rituxan over other options?
Steve, happy to go first if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, it's definitely top of mind. I mean, I think with the approval, Briumvi, another anti-CD20, I mean, does this further cement, the ability of anti-CD20s to work well, in MS? And really happy to hear that conversation today, and obviously be, talking about this further with the folks at Prime here as we're digging in, with our MS class in general, with the emergence of Briumvi. So I absolutely think, that is worth considering. It's definitely been top of mind as far as a recommendation to really ease up on the PA criteria, that of course has to go through our P&T. I think where some of the hesitancy, to recommend that one to patients, providers as first line, just is because, some lack of evidence there and not having the FDA approval. But I'm curious, as far as the neurologist on the call too, as far as I know, the ICER report talked a little bit about what does the approval of Briumvi mean for Ocrevus and Rituxan. Do we think that Briumvi will get more use than Rituxan? I know one of the models said, when we broke down those 4 monoclonal antibodies, I think it was like 45% Ocrevus, 45% Rituxan. We haven't been seeing that. To David's point about pulling back PA criteria and using that as a lever to try to drive some shift over to those biosims and Rituxan. We're definitely interested in that, but just curious as far as the neurologist perspective, if they see increased use of Rituxan and the biosims with this approval, and if it kind of cements the place in therapy with those anti-CD20s with this new approval.
And why don't we let the clinical experts comment, and then I'll circle back to David in case he wants to answer that same question about shifting or prioritizing use of Rituxan. And we'll talk later about the specifics of that through step therapy, et cetera, but just kind of in a general way. But Annetta, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we started using an awful lot. We started using rituximab in 2008 and a lot of it by 2012 as a first-line therapy. So we now have over a decade of experience, as does the country of Sweden, using it as a first-line treatment. And the rest of the world is catching up, after the approval and the approval of Ocrevus in March of 2017, and then the availability of it in September. I'll let Bruce speak to that, but it seems that is the trend. Everybody's starting to realize that there really is a magic bullet for this disease. If in the relapsing phase, if you can get them on these drugs very, very early, doesn't work that well in progressive. And if they've already had a lot of relapse and they already have some residual disability, I'm not sure we can shut down the relapses, but it's not as good. But if you really at diagnosis, start them on a B-cell depleting therapy, and then just are careful not to overdose them and really help find that lowest effective dose for them, or dose, infrequent infusions, these patients do extremely well. I think, what I'm hearing from you guys is what I've heard from my colleagues on the outside. The prior auth is a big burden to practicing clinicians. They don't get reimbursed for that time. So if you guys approve without prior auth Ocrevus, but you make them fill out a prior auth form for Rituxan or rituximab biosimilars, they're just going to keep giving Ocrevus.
Okay, that's helpful. David, go ahead. Or I'm sorry, well, go ahead, David first, and then maybe Bruce if he has anything to add.
Yeah, no, I mean, we would love to use Rituxan first line, but regulatory, we would never survive because it doesn't have FDA approval for this. If a big governing body like Medicare did for Avastin eye therapy came out and said to the health plans, we actually want you to put Avastin as first line use, we approve it, we could do it. But absent some big regulatory authority saying this is as good, I think it'd be very hard for us. The other thing I'm realizing here as I was reviewing things is, wow, policy for Rituxan, we're pushing people to Ocrevus. It's a very simple prior auth. It's just diagnosis, are you a neurologist? So there's nothing complex about it, but I grant it, people are going to choose it, especially if other insurers on our market aren't approving Rituxan. And, can we structure our benefits to encourage at least patients to want it? And something take away from this meeting for us to look at.
Okay. Bruce, and what you want to say, I would also invite you to comment, because I can't remember myself, I'm sorry, whether the existing clinical guidelines that payers would look at mention Rituxan as a reasonable, choice in this category of treatments, or are they silent on it because it doesn't have an FDA approval?
So most of us would consider ocrelizumab and rituximab equivalent. That there's very little, if any, difference. They work in the same way. They have the same impact. And as Annetta said earlier, the decision making regarding licensing was driven more by the company's economic benefits than it was by any difference between the drugs. So from that perspective, if I could get rituximab, I would use it. The issue of what impact ubelizumab may have has really to do with what happens behind the scenes. And as we saw with glitterimer, when the third glitterimer alternative entered the market, the costs started to go down. And so the various negotiations that are going to take place that are going to affect the net price of a B-cell depleting drug from a given PBM and insurance carrier is going to depend on those negotiations, which we have no way of knowing, and that's what's going to depend on the formulary placement. The biggest problem we have, and this was alluded to earlier, is that many of the savings that occur through those sorts of negotiations don't get passed on to the patients. And I think it was mentioned earlier that when dimethyl fumarate went generic, my patients' out-of-pocket costs went up. So instead of paying nothing or $10 a month or whatever it was for their drug, they all of a sudden are paying $300 a month, and that's higher on an annual basis than your estimated wholesale acquisition cost. And so where that money is going is it's going into the profit margins of the intermediates. And so until the system translates into decreased cost to the end users, as well as increased profit margins to the intermediates in the distribution chain, we're not really going to see reform.
So Bruce and Annetta, thank you. Any health plan out there in America looking for some external authoritative body to back them up if they want to do more with Rituxan, obviously they can look to our notes, but they usually would start by looking at the clinical guidelines from the American Academy of Neurology or some similar group. What leeway do they have based on those guidelines to be more favorable to Rituxan? Any?
Well, so the AAN's guideline do mention rituximab as an option for people with like high coinsurance or in difficulties with insurance. So it is captured under that group. I believe so they have applied for, and I'm not sure where they are in the process, but they are looking for approval at the Swedish Medical Authority. So it's a little bit different than the EMA. Again, I suppose I would ask this question. If diroxymethylfumarate and monomethylfumarate were approved just because they showed similar chemical composition to dimethylfumarate, why is rituximab not approved as it works exactly in the same way as ocrelizumab, right? And so I think what it comes back to is that filing for FDA approval is incredibly expensive and incredibly time consuming. And this drug has been abandoned by its manufacturer. And there's no incentive for manufacturers of biosimilars to engage in that lengthy process for approval for a new indication, given the fact that they're going to make most of their money in the lymphoma market.
Right. Well, given that background, I might suggest that, again, to the extent that it's not proactively addressed by the clinician specialty societies as a reasonable alternative, that the David Dohans of the world will go looking for it and not finding it will feel that their hands are somewhat tied. Maybe not every insurer will proceed in the same way, but I continually hear how often they will look for clinical guidelines, and they really do. Sometimes for an off-label treatment, they would need a positive affirmation that it can be used in lieu of a labeled drug, or they do feel like it's going to be a tricky situation for them.
So can I ask a question regarding that? To the representatives that are on the call, like Dr. Dohan. Let's say that the National MS Society or the MS Coalition came out with a statement regarding the suitability of rituximab for people with multiple sclerosis. Would that be enough to make it available?
David had to drop. Oh, David's still there. Good. But either one of you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It would not. We have it available. So, and again, I think if it came up now, we would not. And the reason for us, because so much stuff can be used off-label, it's an easy thing as an insurance company to go, we're just approving FDA-approved diagnosis and keep it there. And we do occasionally stray from that, like we did with this. And there's a few other examples, but it's a simple way because otherwise you get bombarded. But so we do have it available. The question for us, where we really need, is to make this the first line treatment. So right now it's equal to Ocrevus. You can get either one. I personally think it's equal to Ocrevus. If I was a patient, I would choose Rituxan. But as an insurance company, we can't tell people you need to use Rituxan first or have a reason not to use it over Ocrevus.
Dan, did you want to answer the question too, if there's anything different?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the payer side, we've been looking at rituximab for a long time and looking at guidelines and seeing what we can do to support. I think at this point in time, I mean, I think it's obvious that we can't support a step, on some of these other products. We can't push everyone through a Rituxan or a biosim product, but I think we can do, and we'll see what P&T says, in February, as far as proposal of drawing back the criteria, easing on that criteria is using that lever. And I do have an example of when we've done that in the past, Steve, on dimethyl fumarate and pulling back some of that PA and some of the data we've seen there. I don't want to deter us, from where we're headed this conversation, but looking forward to comment on that as well. It's definitely a lever, management in this class, I talked about that $6 PMPM number. You're really talking about 13 out of every 10,000 patients in our book of business, with the MS drug on file for us in 2022. And that's 3% of spend, so it's such a high spend category. We really want to do our best to use whatever, lever is possible. And I think in a lot of ways it's pulling back PA criteria and allowing additional access. And it's an exciting time. I mean, we have emergence of multiple generics now with dimethyl fumarate, fingolimod, Tyramer, Aubagio, teriflunomide will be generic, hopefully soon here in 2023. So we totally agree with giving patients, plenty of options as far as treatment. And it's an exciting time with the generics coming through. So I'll hold on the dimethyl fumarate story for now, Steve, until you give me the green light.
Let me come back briefly, again, in my role as devil's advocate, gentle one, I hope. But is there any way you can reassure us that the rebates that, pharmacy benefit managers take off the brand prices is not a barrier to Rituxan gaining their approval as a first line or equal to patients? Because many people might assume that we'll see the same problems with biosimilars coming into this space as have been seen in some of the other autoimmune spaces, where rebates don't always make it as straightforward as it seems like it should be to prioritize a lower priced drug. So rebates are still going to be part of this, but like, how does a PBM walk away from a $20,000 rebate to push a drug that costs $4,000?
I mean, I can say in our strategy conversations, I mean, we're about low net cost. And I mean, the difference here, as we've seen today, I mean, you take the WAC numbers that Dr. Whittington had earlier, potentially $5,000 a year for Rituxan and the biosims versus, I think Briumvi is closer to $59,000, and then, up into the six-figure mark for Tysabri. So, I mean, with that sort of gap, I don't think you can ignore, having that low net cost therapy as an option for patients, especially from what we've heard, from the providers today.
And
Well, one of
Steve,
our recommendations.
Rebates are part of it, but what we heard from Bruce and Annetta, and what I hear from people with MS quite frequently is, even when they move to a generic, the cost sharing they have is higher. So there's the rebates, but then there's also the tier that the drug gets put on. And so, we've seen sort of this specialty generic tier pop up, which still is a co-insurance for people, which is what makes the cost share unaffordable. If we really want to drive incentives towards people using generics, then it has to be a generic copay.
That was going to be one of my questions for you later, Barry. Aligning the savings, if you will, with what patients experience has to be part of getting this right. And it sounds like we have some really dysfunctional situations going on out there.
We do. I just want to also add that, MS is very new to the generic and biosimilar space. And with that has to come education and developing the comfort level, not just driving price or financial incentives for people with MS and MS neurologists. We have to, Bruce talked about in MS, we don't ever really want to change someone's medication if they're doing well on it, because you don't know what's going to happen. And that factors into some of the hesitancy that we see in the community on generics and biosimilars. So we have to take our time and do that education right to build that comfort level and willingness to try generics and biosimilars rather than blindly try and financially incentivize it, because it's not going to work.
I'd also
Would
like
you-
to add, oh,
Oh, I'm sorry, Lauren, yes.
I just want to add my own personal experience with switching to generics from name brand Tecfidera. I and peers that I know with MS have taken advantage of a lot of pharmaceutical companies have copay assistance programs, which are very helpful and kind of go above and beyond insurance to make sure that we get that coverage without any gaps. When I was switched to generic, that copay assistance program is no longer applicable. The generic company doesn't have one. So although my generic copay, thankfully right now with my insurance, is quite low, I am now actually paying a copay, whereas I did not before on the name brand.
Yeah, I was going to say, our team mentioned that to you before, that and this ultimately seems like it's going to have to be the responsibility of the payer to realize that if they're going to prioritize a generic for which there will not be a patient copay assistance program, they have to figure out how to make that whole, help patients stay whole in one way or the other. So it's going to be part of the consideration. But again, if we're talking about a gap in net cost of $4,000 to $50,000, there's enough money saved there to help patients not have to be the ones who suffer. Actually, I want to go to some of the NMSS's recommendations and talk through what we can do to achieve them. Can we have the next slide, please? I hope they are listening. In the background, if somebody who is listening on the ICER staff can go ask them to put up the slide.
We're pulling it up, Steve.
Okay, great. So Barry and Lauren, you will recognize these as, I'm not sure if it's a comprehensive list, I think it is, of your policy recommendations. And just want to see if we can quickly validate them as something that we can try to understand in the marketplace. All right, I hope we can get that slide up in a sec. Here we go. Okay. I'll just really quickly read them. All available medications for a particular disease must not be on a specialty tier with coinsurance. I think we've kind of already, we've mentioned this to a certain extent. Prior authorization should happen before the person with MS leaves the provider's office. Prior authorization approval should be good for a lengthy period of time, including across multiple years, as long as the person is stable. Formulary coverage, including cost sharing, must be easily accessible, understandable, and searchable when people with MS are choosing a health plan. And factors used in formulary decision-making should be transparent and should include patient-centered factors. Actually, of all of these bullets, can I invite you, Barry, to say more about what you mean, in particular about the last one? Because if I'm a health plan reading that, I'm not really sure perhaps what you mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So, too often, right, the decision-making happens at P&T committees or business committees behind the scenes. We know rebates are a big factor in those decisions, but that's not transparent. It's not, while we suspect that finances are driving a lot of the decision making, it's one of those things that generally isn't talked about, nor to your point, sort of how much that rebate is or where that money is going. And when we talk about patient-centered factors, these are some of the things that we talked about earlier today. So if you think about the side effect profile of medications, or we have different mechanisms of action and different routes of administration across the MS medication. So it matters for someone's lifestyle as to whether an infused product is right for them, or a self-injectable, or an oral. All of those things need to be taken into consideration around the decision about what medication is right for which individual. Because the only medication that's going to help someone is the one that they're able to stay on continuously.
Great, thanks. So I think some of the others are more straightforward, and I can focus on some of these just to get some feedback maybe from the payers. So the first one, for instance, and we do our own, and Barry knows this and has helped, we do our own reports on barriers to fair access, and we focus on whether a drug is fairly priced, and when it is, we say that it should be at the lowest relevant tier for patients, or an equivalent alternative. But how do you guys feel about this general guidance that for a patient facing treatment, that not all of the medication should be on a specialty tier with co-insurance? Is that doable, or is that really not feasible the way that the benefit designs are created these days? Dan, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I can try, Steve. I mean, we've seen, I mean, like I said, 19 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. I mean, our clients' opinions really vary as far as benefit designs. You know, from there, they're taking it to an employer group. So there's a lot of variability there as far as what different clients, what employer groups deem as an appropriate benefit. So it's a tough one to answer, you know, from a Prime Therapeutics perspective on that. I totally can understand that. I mean, it's definitely something that's considered when, are we looking at staying with brand Tecfidera, moving to the drastically lower cost generic dimethyl fumarate? You know, we realize that those generics aren't always going to have coupon cards associated with them. And that is unfortunate. Definitely totally hear those concerns. We'll take that back. Making sure that that's brought into those decision-making processes. But I can tell you that, I mean, as far as generics emerging, I mean, it's an exciting time as far as keeping these medications affordable. Like I said, this is just a huge spend category for everyone. So I think it's an exciting time with generics. We still have some work to do, I think, as far as some of the concerns that have been addressed here today as far as affordability. But I mean, to take the two decisions and look, should we continue to go with a manufacturer that has a brand name medication, Tecfidera, and offers a coupon card versus moving to a generic that we know will have multiple manufacturers? I think dimethyl fumarate has over 10, you know, as of today, with that price just, you know, plummeting with generic emergence. You know, it's a tough one. I'll stop there, Steve. It's a tough question.
Yeah. Bruce, and then David, if you want to. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, so I think the issue with this point, and I don't want to get away from this, it's not an issue of whether you use brand name Tecfidera or whether you use one of the generics. I think the concern that I have is, and this is the focus of the report, is that any patient that needs it should be able to get any appropriate class of initial medication. All right, and you know, whether it's rituximab or ocrelizumab, or whether it's dimethyl fumarate or Tecfidera, is not really the issue. The issue is, you know, if all of a sudden all of the generics were available on a prescriptive form, but the drug that the patient needs isn't, we still have a problem.
David, did you have anything you wanted to say about this idea of not all treatments for a particular disease should be on a specialty tier with co-insurance?
You know, I think that's really, you know, we have employer groups who are footing the bill. And although I understand, I think, you know, by structuring their plans that way, it sometimes lowers their premiums to allow more of their employees to have an affordable health care option. So I think it's a balancing act. I don't think there's a straightforward answer. But in general,
I've seen
I agree.
Yeah, there's such a tension that you highlight here that I've heard more or less about over the years. As you know, I think some payers, and by payers, like it can either be the health plan or the PBM or even the plan sponsor will say, I'll have co-insurance, but I'll have a cap that each month, even if it's co-insurance, it can't be above, you know, X $100 or something like that per month. So there are different ways that people sometimes try to split the difference. And I've been in a room, this was a long time ago, but I was really surprised. I was in a room of a variety of different employers. As you say, to a certain extent, they quote unquote pay the bills. And they said they wanted patients to pay a lot out of pocket so that they would appreciate the value that they're receiving from their health insurance, from their employer. Because the employer is paying a whole lot of money. They wanted the individual employee to pay a lot also, because that would, only that way would they pay attention and feel like they were getting good value for their health insurance, because otherwise they would have had to pay 50,000. So it was a very, maybe I shouldn't characterize it in the way I might in private. That was an opinion, but it's out there that patients share to the extent that it will make them feel better about their employer for providing very high cost drugs to them. So just if you sit with that, it was an interesting meeting. Annette, go ahead. Annette, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so wow, that's a very interesting perspective. I mean, I understand when we're looking at these medications that don't come even close to any quality threshold pricing, that there are going to be specialty tiers. But I can just tell you, like when I started at Kaiser in 2009, 2010, there were two copays, $5 or $10, $5 for generic and $10 for your prescription for a brand name product. And that has changed dramatically over the last 14 years. I mean, patients have, depending on what ACA policy they have both a deductible right up front, and then and on top of that, they'll have a 20% coinsurance or higher, depending on which plan they purchased. And that gets dizzying. And they've created, I think we went from 3 tiers to now 6 tiers. And it is odd, even though dimethyl tecfidera was in the highest tier because it's one of the least cost-effective medicines at the old price, it is now super inexpensive and is cost-effective. Why didn't that drop back down to a generic tier? Why isn't that back to a $5 copay? And if my Kaiser pharmacy colleagues are listening, I'm still asking that question, right?
Yeah. Well, that is one of ICER's developed with, patient groups and others. That is one of our fair access criteria, which is, and it is in part to recognize that short of using it to some extent as a part of negotiation, we need to send a signal to manufacturers that a price that will come down lower should be linked to a preferable tier placement. Even if there's other competitive issues going on, that if we have a fairly priced drug, it should be on the lowest relevant tier for patients, full stop. Barry?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of criticism across the healthcare sector about the copay assistance that manufacturers provide. And that, can take a whole separate 5-hour conversation. Yeah. But it's these kind of policies that are driving patients to rely on that. I mean, in a survey that the National MS Society did in 2019, 70% of people have used copay assistance or financial assistance at some point to get their medication. And that 70% number is in literature as well. It's not just from our survey, but also from our survey, 40% of people are not taking their medication as prescribed due to cost. So, and that's not showing up in things like script refills. They're skipping doses here and there, they're stretching them out. It may be so minute that it's not showing up when you're looking at script refills, like I said, but it's impacting the efficacy of their medication. And then we can be really quick to just say patients aren't adherent. It's not that patients don't want to be adherent, but we're not taking the time to ask why. It's not the trouble with the people, it's the trouble with the systems and processes that we've built around it.
Yeah. And in some ways, and I think this was part of what Annetta's work at Kaiser showed, if you improve access and if you can get a lower price, you can also drive through increased utilization and increased adherence to a certain extent. The revenues to the drug maker might be flat to improved. So there is a potential win-win here. Okay, I would love to spend as much time on each of these bullets in a way, but some of these are process things that I think we can almost say to a certain extent yes to. I'm sure there are kind of practical barriers and other things, but I want to move on because I want to spend enough time to talk about some of the specifics of the potential prior auth for ublituximab. And then I do want to come back to the broader kind of payment issues. So what I'm looking at is kind of a list of what a prior auth policy, I should say, might look like in a payer. And they usually start with something around clinical eligibility. They have exclusion criteria. There are considerations around step therapy, duration of coverage. And those are the ones I'm going to focus on the most. And what we usually talk about is how are these populated by evidence from the clinical trials or from other sources as the health plans start to create their coverage policies. So first on clinical eligibility. So again, think about ublituximab now that it's approved. And as Dan said, a lot of the payers take a little bit of time. Sometimes they put a block on coverage for a number of months before they have a formal coverage policy, and they kind of otherwise do one by one kind of coverage approvals. But let's say clinical eligibility. So the trial for ublituximab was adults 18 to 55. They had a diagnosis of RMS as per the McDonald criteria. I'm assuming that no insurer uses these McDonald criteria, some kind of check to make sure that patients have RMS. But I need to ask that as a slight question. Dan or David, are you familiar with whether, or clinical experts, you could say, no, that would be ridiculous because we hardly ever use them in clinical practice, et cetera. But the McDonald criteria, is that something that a health plan should consider using to identify whether patients have RMS?
We never use it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, Steve, as far as like our prime standard recommendations are
That's what I thought.
typically deferring to providers on attestation that the diagnosis meets it there.
Okay. I'm going to go quickly through some of them like that because there are others I think we'll spend more time on. So I do have at least one policy from a national payer that covers the issue of active disease, because that was an eligibility criterion. They had to have active disease, which I believe was, I forget now, but I've got a coverage policy here that says they have to have had at least 2 relapses within the previous 2 years or 1 relapse within the previous year. That's how they have operationalized active disease. Is it clinically reasonable to try to ask clinicians to identify whether patients have active disease before approving coverage for something like ublituximab? Not all payers do. Other payers that we looked at did not have anything about specifying what active disease meant.
So
Well,
Steve,
the
is
goal of any treatment is to not have active disease. And so essentially a policy like that would mean the product's only available to people who are doing really poorly, which I don't think is what's going to be best or what we really want to say about a highly effective medication.
Right. I mean, my understanding, as we've all heard throughout the course of the day, is that the field really has moved in the past 6 years to the idea that many patients should be started on a highly effective therapy. And so the idea that they have to, but still, I'm just kind of curious, is there any reason that would be reasonable to have a plan say that you have to have a certain number of relapses to qualify for treatment?
Yeah, so that would be inconsistent with clinical practice. Now, the issue of active disease refers to, and we tend to define that as people having had a relapse or people having evidence of inflammation that's on MRI. And virtually anybody presenting for an initial therapy with ublituximab is likely to satisfy that criteria.
Now, what if they were on a fumarate already and had been on a fumarate for years, and now they want ublituximab?
So then the issue is a little bit more complicated. They might potentially be switched from one therapy to another because they get a monitoring MRI scan which shows new lesions, which would meet the criteria as we use them in the field of active disease.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now that, the term active is somewhat ambiguous and could be defined different ways. All right. But generally, we refer to it as evidence of disease activity, which means evidence of inflammation that occurs either clinically or on MRI. And then you also heard reference to this NEDA criteria, no evidence of disease activity, which also includes worsening of clinical function. And so you might also potentially want to switch somebody who has evidence of worsening on whatever disease modifying therapy there are to a more potent therapy. And there, the issue of whether or not that would be accepted as a definition of activity would be potentially contentious.
Thanks. Annetta, go ahead.
So 2 comments. I think, they're getting at putting people with active relapsing remitting disease on the medication and avoiding giving it to like inactive advanced SPMS or PPMS patients. But as Bruce pointed out, simply a relapse is not the clinical standard. We would judge that based on disease activity as well. And another good reason people want to switch is pregnancy planning. And they very well may be stable on dimethyl fumarate or natalizumab or their S1P1 inhibitor, but they don't want to be exposed to that, and they want to reduce the risk of rebound relapses before starting to try to get pregnant. Because the other beauty of the B-cell depleting therapies, we give it to them before conception. They get pregnant, they have their babies, they sail through. Most of my patients breastfeed for 1 year. They don't have relapses during pregnancy or the postpartum period. And then we talk about when we start to resume therapy. So it is sort of the optimal therapy for women with more active disease. And, if they're on natalizumab, of course, by definition, they're not going to have disease activity, but they will if you stop them and didn't allow them to bridge with a B-cell depleting therapy.
Great. I love the extra context and nuance to that. One other small piece of clinical eligibility we've seen in some of the national payers, at least one, is linked to the clinical eligibility criterion that their EDSS be between 0 to 5.5 and not above that. If they were above that, they weren't eligible for the trial. What one national plan has is a requirement that patients are able to ambulate without aid for at least 100 meters. I have no idea how that, maybe that is the specific definition of
EDSS
EDSS.
definition of 5.5.
Okay, so you can see how this works. Clinical trial. So is that nonsense, or is that not an unreasonable approach to make sure that the right patients are getting this treatment?
So it's really nonsense. All right. And it gets to the comment that you introduced at the very beginning about the person who said they have impairment with disability and they didn't they wanted to still be considered and have access to treatment. The fact is, there is still potential benefit from treatment in people who use mobility aids. The reason for placing people in a clinical trial has more to do with the likelihood of measuring the endpoints that you're trying to measure in the clinical trial and the ability to show differences than it does with every potential clinical application.
Okay, great. Will, you're probably surprised, but I'm actually going to ask you a question now. It's been a while, so thank you for holding on. And I'm guessing in your role, your technical title, I think, is Access Marketing and HEOR, right? You're executive director. So you probably know everything about how the national plans are covering Ocrevus, because that was going to be you were likely going to be following in the footprint of what coverage it looked like for Ocrevus, right? So
it's difficult to say that you would know every plan in this country and how they're covering Ocrevus and all the details, but certainly familiar with the overall coverage for Ocrevus, yes.
So I'll start with you, and you probably know that some payers, we could be wrong because the things change pretty rapidly sometimes, but we had evidence that some payers are still requiring step therapy through a generic fumarate or fingolimod to get Ocrevus.
Absolutely, yeah.
So do you anticipate that being the situation for your drug?
Given that historical context, yes, we would anticipate that, that may likely be the case at certain payers for ublituximab or Briumvi as well. I think the position at TG is much like we've heard during this call from Barry, and I think certainly we heard from Lauren as well, is that we would advocate patients have access to options, right? We think Briumvi is a great option for patients. We think there's certainly a lot of benefits with, strong clinical data. Dr. Langer-Gould, you mentioned the 1-hour infusion and some of the benefits that could provide as well. But I think from our perspective, our hope would be, that patients are able to access the therapy, and we certainly have, the way in which we brought this to market has been to talk to various stakeholders, and including the payer community about, what is the best way to bring it to market to optimize patient access for Briumvi.
So I wanted to start from the market access aspect, if you will, and then circle back to the patients and the clinical experts. Step therapy for ublituximab through a fumarate or fingolimod. Consistent with clinical guidelines first? Could a health plan look at a clinical guideline and say, I've got justification for doing that because it says that these are reasonable, moderately effective therapies, if that's the current nomenclature. But go ahead and emote if you will, or use whatever verb you want. What do you
So
think?
I'll let Barry speak to what the MS Coalition has put together, but the American Academy of Neurology's guidelines is more like a list of suggestions. It's and with consensus opinion from experts. So there's nothing in there that would say you have to require that it's okay to say everybody has to step through. And I will just say that I think it's crazy. Since 2013, Kaiser's had a published policy that patients get access to highly effective therapy right away if they have, highly active disease. And now over 80% of our patients are started on rituximab right away because of the tremendous clinical efficacy. The problem with stepping through dimethyl fumarate, once again, is that our most disadvantaged patients, the young patients with highly active disease, African Americans, Hispanic patients with unstable insurance, unstable employment, they are not going to be able to continue dimethyl fumarate for multiple reasons. And that it's not reasonable to say, take it, lose your insurance, and then that's your failure. And deny them access right away to a highly effective therapy. And then there's lots of patients where they really have very active disease at the onset. And that's, forcing them through that and saying you have to have a relapse or a really bad side effect. How do you know that's not the relapse that leaves them with permanent disability that they don't make a full recovery from? So I want to circle back to that EDSS is 6.0, right? So the 6.0 is a cane. People can be left with that from one bad relapse and yet have quiescent disease for decades afterwards when they're on highly effective therapy and lead a good normal life, quality of life. I think what they're getting at is to try and weed out progressive patients in which they did not seek a labeled indication and did not do a clinical trial. From a safety perspective, we do have data 6.5 and above. So Walker, this is how crazy that scale is. You go from a 6 to a 6.5, and a 6.5 to a 7 means you went from a cane to a walker to a wheelchair. And down the scale below, you just got a few more sensory deficits and you got a whole point difference. That we do have data showing that 6.5 and above, those patients are at higher risk of serious infections. So it wouldn't be a reason to force them to step through, but it might be a reason for clinicians to reconsider if you have somebody with more advanced disability and inactive disease. And certainly be honest with your patients about that.
Okay, good. Laura.
I think a consideration of the step through should also be, the side effects that we talked about. I believe the number was something like half of the patients put on dimethyl fumarate don't continue due to the gastrointestinal and the flushing side effects, which, speaking from experience, are not comfortable. So why are we going to put these patients that already have this devastating disease through more hoops and through more side effects to ultimately get to the drug that they need to be on?
So the answer to that question. It's almost where we started. It's because fumarates are a little over $1 a pill at Mark Cuban, and certainly far less expensive. That's why people like Annetta are kind of woken up in the middle of the night sweating, because they could save just as much almost by going to Rituxan and have a completely different kind of clinical situation going on. But I wasn't surprised to hear that reaction. I'm wondering, is there any part of this, Dan or David, that is the fact that fumarates are oral and, Rituxan and ublituximab and others will probably be on the Part B, the medical side of the benefit. Does that play some role in the desire for some plans to want to do step therapy through an oral, or does that have nothing to do with that situation?
Go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say, I think looking at what the cost is on both sides is extremely important. You have to, that's why integration between medical and pharmacy benefit is so important, because we need to be seeing, what these patients are shifting to, what the cost, potentially to go from one agent on the pharmacy benefit over to the medical would be. I'll turn it over to you, David, for comment.
I was just going to comment. The medical versus pharmacy benefit gets tricky, and one we're struggling with because many of our employers carve out the pharmacy benefit. So, if we put something on medical benefit with a step therapy through a pharmacy benefit, that's difficult to do because we don't know what their pharmacy benefit is. but something we're trying to get better about integrating.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, one last question about specific coverage criteria issues before we kind of back up again and see the big picture. Every health plan policy has a duration of coverage before it has to be renewed. And sometimes the renewal is hinging upon some kind of physician attestation that the patient is benefiting or some kind of clinical or other outcome. So when we looked, most of the plans that we saw had duration of coverage for 6 to 12 months, which means that at 6 or 9 or 12 months, something has to happen. The clinician's office has to say, yes, it's working, or they have to say, prove that the patient is still EDSS 0 to 5.5 or whatever it might be. Am I crazy in thinking that if patients want another prescription for it, it's probably working and they're probably not going to be an unreasonable candidate for continued coverage? And the times that you would end up finding that the request for attestation didn't lead to an approval of subsequent therapy would be 0%. So I'm wondering, do we, from the payers, why would anybody feel like you need a 6 to 12 month initial coverage phase that would have to have subsequent kind of annual renewals in this kind of situation?
So I will answer or try to answer it. So I think some people not necessarily in the MS field, but some things is to make sure the patient is actually still seeing the provider and the provider is just not writing scripts without reassessing the patient is part of the rationale that, for less concerning meds, maybe they don't even need to be on them anymore, that they could stop if the person came in to see the provider. Again, not true in the MS field. For the Part B drugs, I must admit, I've never understood the rationale because they're seeing the provider by getting the Part B drug. But with our Medicaid product, we have to take directions from the state, and the state has this throughout many of their criteria. And speaking to them, I mean, that's part of the rationale, whether you agree with it or not. And I think we do get somewhere the provider just goes, haven't seen this person, I didn't even know I was prescribing it. It just gets automatically renewed. But again, I don't think in the MS field that's an issue.
Dan?
Yeah, I would agree with that, David, as far as the MS field. I mean, and I think in general, renewal criteria, I mean, we've looked at creative ways to try to minimize any sort of block there as far as the renewal goes, and how can we automatically approve different PAs. It's harder on the medical side, with a leg, and you don't have that point of sale, blocking it and ability to push it through as far as a renewal goes. But I mean, I think that's historically what clients and employer groups have wanted, is to just assure some management there. And it's kind of just been standardized in a lot of different criteria, unfortunately, even in the MS space. So I think, David, you hit the nail right on as far as in the MS class, maybe it doesn't make as much sense, but I think there's other scenarios where that renewal criteria, makes a lot of sense for different categories.
It's kind of fun to find. I mean, we know that rules have to exist for the thousands of drugs that are approved and other medical services too. But in some ways, it's helpful to find these situations where they just don't seem to make much sense. I mean, we've looked at lots of drugs ourselves where the risk-benefit ratio is so narrow, or you really do want to stop the drug because of toxic side effects if you're not getting a certain amount of benefit, or at least have the lab checked. So there are lots of reasons why the 6-month even kind of framework makes sense for some of those drugs, but I just didn't feel like it held much water here. So let's then back up. We've got about 20 minutes to go, and I want to talk more about kind of pricing and cost considerations. Barry or Lauren, again, just to ground us, how bad is it? I mean, you had some statistics, I think, Barry, on the number of patients who are either skipping treatments or abandoning treatments because of the cost. What can you kind of ground us again in what you understand of that landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but that average, I think the median brand price right now for MS medications is well into the low 90,000s. So that's for the brand. Perhaps that comes down a little bit with Briumvi because it is the lowest price brand product now. But all of these things combined between the list prices, the price increases that we've seen, the co-insurance instead of a flat copay, they all coalesce to make things unaffordable for people with MS. And so in our 2019 survey, 70% of people said they rely on financial assistance. So that may be a manufacturer program, it may be a nonprofit program, it could be a coupon or card. 40% said that they were not taking their medication as prescribed. So skipping doses, maybe delaying treatment, those kinds of things. 40% also said that they were making lifestyle choices for themselves and their families to be able to prioritize paying for their medication. And that can mean anything from someone stays in the workforce and prolongs retirement. They don't have savings for higher education for their children. They're using a credit card more often. And we know sort of the stats on medical bankruptcy. So all of those things paint some of the picture of what people with MS are experiencing. And then in the survey that the coalition just did, 30% said that their current or past insurer rejected coverage for their DMT, and 49% said that they had discontinued a DMT. So the number one reason was their doctor's recommendation. So that's good, right? We want that. If it's not working for someone, we want them to stop and try something else or explore options with their healthcare provider. The number two reason was side effects, which means maybe we didn't put them on the right medication in the first place, or we're not tracking on that and paying attention. And the third reason was insurance issues for discontinuation.
So you remember that little hokey diagram that I use in the intro slides about keeping our focus on the patient and the family, but trying to find a balance, if you will. That sure doesn't sound like we're in the right space. There's a balance that we need, but it doesn't sound like that's the right way to get there. And Annette, I grew up prescribing in an era of $5 and $10. I wasn't at Kaiser, but something that felt like that. And so this is all just kind of catastrophic in many ways. Let me just frame that. In a class like this where competition has failed to reduce pricing, is to say, whatever we think about competition, it has just utterly failed. What we end up getting is basically a kind of an arms race where we have a kind of broad choice, which is kind of really the clinical goal and what patients want. And you have tighter utilization restrictions as the only way to kind of manage the problem of all the prices being too high. The other models are to go like a Hep C approach, where when the payers first had 2 Hep C drugs available, they said, I'm only going to cover 1. When they had 4 available, I'm only going to cover 1. And each time I do that, I get to drive a lower price, and I'm limiting choice. And that's the trade-off. I'm not going to let patients have access to every single Hep C treatment. I'm going to pick 1 and get a much lower price thereby. And then the third way that we as a country have been immune to is kind of a protected class approach in which they're all covered and there's no tight utilization in terms of step therapy or all the other things, but we have regulated pricing because we're going to basically admit that competition is not going to align the prices in an affordable way. So there are kind of 3 approaches here, and I would just love your thoughts about the trade-offs between the two, because Barry, I could imagine a health plan or an employer saying, I'll cover 1 highly effective treatment. And by that, I'll say, how low will you go with your price? And I'll get the lowest price available for you, and I'll pass it on to the patient. But I can only do that if I'm only going to offer you 1 monoclonal antibody. Because if you want them all, then a health plan can't do anything. They can't negotiate a lower price. and they can only quote unquote control control costs by kind of doing the things that are in the end run kind of negative for patients in terms of all the utilization barriers. So I'm not saying that it's all that easy. And obviously I have a favorite horse in this race to a certain extent, but let's talk about those broader tensions and how we're doing it. And actually, Annette, if you don't mind, I want to invite Will. Will, you may or may not be able to talk about this in certain ways, but now that you have a price, et cetera, you guys made a choice about your price, and it is lower by a little bit from the list price of ocrelizumab. What's your view of this market? Do you think it's competitive? Do you think it's actually achieving the kind of linkage of price to value for patients that's working, or in some way, do you see a better option going forward?
I don't know from a market picture if I necessarily see a better option in terms of how our system works. I think that's a broader discussion that, Dr. Pearson, obviously you're trying to facilitate here, right? Is how do we get to that? I think, the way we looked at pricing here when we came out with BRIUMVI was, how do we try to optimize access for patients, right? And we want to make sure that we put the choice in the hands of clinicians like Dr. Langer-Gold, right? Like Dr. Cohen, and if a patient is appropriate for BRIUMVI, that those patients can have access to that therapy.
Well, can I remember I played devil's advocate earlier with the payers to a certain extent. So let me just hopefully gently, but in the past 10 years, we've had 2 federal investigations of drug pricing, one for Sovaldi and one for Aduhelm just recently. In both cases, the company said that they were prioritizing access. In both cases, when the government got access to confidential materials, it was quite clear that the slides sent to the CEO and everything else clearly specified that access was not going to be at its highest with the price that they were going to launch at, that they could have improved access more with a lower price, but they would have had to give up revenue. So I appreciate what you're saying about maximizing access, but all the publicly available information suggests that that's not the way the market works.
So I can't speak to other organizations, right? And what those decisions may have been. What I can tell you is I think in our case, you can look at it and say, the evidence would suggest that we indeed did, right, stick to that. I mean, we are, as Barry mentioned before, we priced as the lowest branded agent available within MS, right? In fact, roughly 20% lower than what Ocrevus is priced at today, current pricing. So, I can sit here and say we did a lot of due diligence. I think access, though, means many things. There is payer access on one end. There's physical access to products. How do we make sure that that is as seamless for patients as possible? And we spent a lot of time talking about out-of-pocket costs for patients as well. So when we looked at pricing, we spent a lot of time talking to, as a matter of fact, both the folks who are here with us from a payer perspective, as well as many others, in terms of what price, what market entry was going to optimize access from a payer perspective and coverage, as well as talking to, folks like Barry and some of the other advocacy groups, getting the perspective of patients and getting the perspective of providers as well. So I think when you think about it from a manufacturer perspective, you're really triangulating all the different stakeholders across the system to figure out what is the best way to do this so that when a patient's appropriate for BRIUMVI, they can get on that medication.
All right. Thank you for accepting my devil's advocate question. I appreciate that. Annette, thank you for being patient. Go ahead.
That was really interesting. I want to point out that there is a 4th option, and it's the model we've been using at Kaiser, and it has worked incredibly well. So we do ask that everyone, we created a risk stratified cost sensitive formula. So the clinicians worked directly with the pharmacists who work for health plan to create a rational step formulary. So what that means is that if you need a highly effective therapy, or your doctor says you need a highly effective therapy, you will get one. You don't have to step through anything else. And if you want a modestly effective therapy and your doctor thinks that that's the right thing for you, you can get one of those. And we have multiple options in the modestly effective therapy category. But if efficacy and safety are the same, you're going to be asked to take the lowest cost one first. with a low threshold for switching if you have side effects. So that what that essentially, and that we have been able to create competition in the market space doing that. So we have a really low, we have an affordable version of glatiramer acetate. We are able to create competition in the beta interferon space. Now with multiple generics available for dimethyl fumarate and soon from fingolimod, we've been able to negotiate great prices. And then of course, with the biosimilars for rituximab, we have fantastic prices on that. The one exception would be natalizumab, where we obviously don't have any competition and it's super, super expensive. But in a small subgroup of patients, it's still the right treatment to start on. And there is no prior auth. If that's what the MS neurologist says they need, they get it. And that's the deal we've made. We promise that we will do our best to prescribe rationally and to keep costs in mind. And in exchange, the pharmacists need to sort of bud out. They can show us our numbers quarterly and we can break it down. And if we do see that there's some irrational prescribing practices, 80-year-olds in nursing homes still getting their brand name Copaxone, then, we will work on that. But there has to be some sort of trust and faith between the two groups. And that's something that can be recreated in the fee-for-service world, but it would mean that the MS experts would need to stop taking so much money from pharma, so stop lining their pockets, and come to the table with the insurance plans and the pharmacy benefits managers. And the pharmacy benefits managers would have to forgo these weird things that they do where they don't pass the cost savings down to the patient directly. But that model has worked incredibly well. Our expenditures now are far lower on MS drugs than they were in 2011. And our relapse rate and disease control is far superior. So that's, we're trying to sort of mimic something along the lines of a universal healthcare system. And that's with 25% of our patients moving between Kaiser and county, the safety net systems and back again, where we know they're basically not going to get any neurological care if they have to go down to LA County. They're lucky if they even get seen by a neurologist. They'll probably never get a treatment. Yeah. But they'll come back to Kaiser eventually. So there's something in it for us to make sure their disease is controlled.
By the way, thank you. I think that stands, as you said, as another leg on a possible approach. Real quickly, do you guys switch people as part of this approach, or only are you talking about the new starts that you target this?
No, yeah, we switch absolutely new members, and it was a very painful process. If they're on Avonex, which is ridiculously highly priced, and the best negotiated price we have is on Beta Seron, we talk to them, but we're very honest.
But when you get into the highly effective treatment zone, would you switch someone from ofatumumab to Rituxan?
Yes, absolutely. If they come in, we explain to them why, we explain to them the rationale, and again, low threshold of switching if they need to go back. There are a proportion of patients, and we roll them over to Truxima and Reabni, and it really is manageable. But this is something that Kaiser has a lot of experience when generics come out, and it does work. So I would counter Barry that you don't know what's going to happen. It's B-cell depleting therapy. The B cells are still depleted. They're not going to have breakthrough disease activity and relapses. It does work very well. It is always a cause of anxiety for patients, and we do have to do a lot of outreach and education every time there's a new biosimilar, but not as much as you would think. We send them letters, and a small proportion will call and say, Dr. Langer, I need an appointment with you. I have to talk to you about this. But most of them sort of accept it and say, okay, well, if you think it's the same, then we'll do this. And they're very happy with the low copays because, each time we get a better price on a rituximab biosimilar, they're paying less out of pocket because it's passed directly on to them. But absolutely, we switch if they come to us on a high price alternative. But we're straightforward about why we do it.
Right. No, I know Kaiser has a program in switching in autoimmune space for rheumatoid arthritis and some other conditions as well. So I know that, and they have some special expert time and experience in doing this in a way that has worked out well. But I agree. Many people do think it's hard to replicate that in other systems, but it's a very valuable experience for us to learn from. Let me go to Dan because we're starting to get down towards the end before I'll invite you guys to make a final statement. But Dan, please go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Just wanted to agree on a couple important points I think Annetta lined out. I mean, as far as that fourth option, that she mentioned is when these drugs go generic, like we talked about with dimethyl fumarate, as far as a strategy perspective, taking a look at what is our prior authorization actually doing? Are we having any denials here? And even if we are, why are we doing that? So we did do that, approximately a year ago or so, brought that out to clients. It's been really, really well received. And I think it is a really important fourth option as we get generics. And fitting for your Hep C example as well, now that we see, those products starting to go to generic. So just wanted to emphasize that. And thanks for pointing that out, Annetta.
Great. Well, in our new approach to what we do with our annual Barriers to Fair Access report, we follow up on the drugs that we review 2 years later, because by then the coverage policies have kind of been, all the dust is settled, and we can try to understand how transparent it has been, whether they're tiered, if they're fairly priced appropriately, all the other criteria we have. And I'm really looking forward to doing that report in this space in a couple of years, and because there will be a lot to learn, because we'll look at usually we look at least at the 15 biggest formularies by head count in the country, and we'll learn how they handle this kind of space differently and what further lessons we can learn. But we'll look forward to framing a lot of what you guys have been talking about into policy recommendations for this report and putting that out soon. So as we round towards the end, I really want to thank you guys for this. This has been wonderful. In the last segment here, I'd like to invite each of you to make a final statement. And we usually challenge you by saying to please do it in a single sentence. I like to say that commas, reasonable commas are welcome. The strategic semicolon will work. But at run-on length, I will start to shut you down because I want to make sure that everybody has a chance. And for your last statement, it can be anything. It can be a theme that you've already talked about and you just want to hit that nail one more time and make sure it rings in people's ears. You can make a request of somebody else at the table, a stakeholder group, to make the future a better place, whether it be for innovation, access, clinical outcomes, however you want to frame it. What would you ask them to do differently going forward, or more of that kind of thing? So feel free to do that. And I'm going to give the patients the final word in this section before we then turn to CEPAC and give them a chance to do the same thing. And Will, I think I'll start with you at the beginning here as we do this tail end. So what would your final thought for us be?
Sure, yeah. So a final thought here from my perspective would be just making sure that patients have access to the therapies that they need, right? Particularly, we've heard in the discussion today about a lot of discussion about the heterogeneity of this disease. I know, Lauren, I think you brought it home very nicely talking about what works for you, but what maybe didn't work for some of your peers. And so I'd leave it at that is access to treatments, because I think every patient, very well may respond differently to a different medication.
Great, thanks very much. David?
Really enjoyed the conversation, especially the expert opinion about Rituxan. Go and take that back to see how we can make Rituxan more favorable both to our providers and make it cheaper for our members, to make it a win-win.
Great, thank you. Dan?
Thanks, Steve. So, I'd echo what Will said. We're here as well as a payer to provide patient access to efficacious, safe medications. But one thing I don't know that we've touched a ton on in this hour and a half is just the value that manufacturers are putting their products at when they come to market. And I think as the 2017 ICER report showed, I think as this ICER report shows, really, a lot of these MS drugs when they come to market are dramatically overpriced. So how do we work to lessen that and make sure that patients can get access to these right away?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bruce?
So I think that the report is very helpful in that it has shown the benefit of the monoclonal antibodies compared to Tecfidera, or rather dimethyl fumarate, and other more moderately affected drugs. And I think it's clearly established that for relapses, and I think that because we know that relapses are related to disability progression, which is what we're really trying to accomplish with treatment, it by extension indicates the benefit of that class for that. I think we've also seen the value of being able to negotiate price if you have a large enough system, as Kaiser does, and potentially gain access to cheaper alternatives, and the need that we have to to take advantage of competition to enhance the availability of these drugs to people who need them at the earliest point when they do.
Great, thanks. Annetta, it helps to have a drug that costs $4,000, doesn't it? In all of this. Anyway, please go
Absolutely.
ahead. Please go ahead.
Yes, so I will finish off by saying it is true that Black and Hispanic patients with MS have worse outcomes in the United States. The elephant in the room is the high price of these drugs, and rituximab biosimilar is the obvious solution. There's plenty of evidence that this will, if you can get them on it early, it will shut the disease down and they will do very well. I ask that the insurance carriers remove the barriers to access to this therapy as a first-line agent, that they pass along the savings directly to the patients, and that the American Academy of Neurology, which has inadvertently aligned itself with the interests of pharma, as most professional societies have, realign themselves with what's in the best interest of our patients, get off the fence about rituximab, and I ask the National MS Society to do the same.
All right. Moving into the end, let's see. Lauren, why don't you have your say now?
Sure. I think I just want to end by saying that patients with MS want efficacious drugs and they want to be on those drugs. And having, removing barriers, being able to go on Rituxan, being able to have that choice of the medication that best fits them is going to really benefit patients in the long run. And that's really beyond business. Benefiting patients is what should come first.
Thank you very much. Well said. Barry?
Lead with patient needs and wants. It will improve health outcomes and in the long run, lower prices and costs.
Okay, great. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. Again, we did this 6 years ago, and I'm thrilled by the innovation, and I'll get to make another closing statement, but your guys' ability to help uncover some of these policy issues, the structural issues, the process issues, and yet grounding it ultimately in the patient, kind of what needs and kind of their need for tailored care is exactly what we need to make more progress. So thank you so much for participating today and for many of you throughout the entire 8 months of this project as we go forward. So thank you again. And let me hand the gavel, if you will, virtual gavel back over to Jason to lead the CEPAC through their set of final comments. And then I'll have a very brief wrap up right at the end. Jason?
Steve, thank you so much. We'll just go, I'm still in the mindset of having a U-shaped table, so we'll go by alphabetical order. I'll start with Rob Asseltine.
Thank you, Jason. I would just say what's true for MS is true for healthcare generally. We need a real market for pharmaceuticals. We need competition, price discovery, and consumer empowerment.
Thank you. Rena Conti.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for a very informative and edifying day. It was really fantastic to include the voices of patients and also providers. So thank you.
Thank you. George Goshua.
It's been a pleasure to learn with you today. One message that sticks home with me is a little bit more from a perhaps methodology standpoint, and it's just thinking about the uncertainty and how it would be really nice to, in this day and age, as we move forward, to be able to have access to individual level patient data, so we don't have to be making decisions and have this uncertainty that comes with aggregate level data, when in fact, the access to individual level patient data is, is indeed in the hands of some of the colleagues that we are working with. And so eliminating some of that uncertainty would be really, really helpful. We struggled a lot with that today, or at least I did.
Thank you. Rebecca Kirsch.
Thank you for a very thoughtful day. I think in terms of that patient data, I absolutely agree. And thinking in particular, what strikes me is that because the cohort of people who are diagnosed quite early in their lives, like Lauren, they're taking these medications for a very long lifetime. It's not like a geriatric population. So the patient data around the impact over time in financial health, as well as mental health and physical health, is something that I think is an important call to action.
Yeah, that's a great point. Steve Kogan.
Well, just thanks first to Lauren and Barry. You really helped us to better understand the impact of this really terrible disease on real life, and can't express enough just how important that perspective has been to us, and your candor has just been terrific. So thanks so much, and kudos to the ICER team. I thought the technical and scientific rigor of this assessment was really top notch.
Yeah, I agree totally. Thank you. Greg Lowe.
Sure. So though I'm aware it's not actually Chinese, I'm as we're approaching Chinese New Year, I'm reminded of the curse, may you live in interesting times. And with the dramatically falling prices for rituximab biosimilars and dimethyl fumarate, and maybe some more biosimilars to come, it's certainly interesting times. So I hope we can realize some savings from those biosimilars while we hopefully have insurers preserving access to new therapies for those who need second and third line therapies.
Aaron Mitchell.
I know these are always issues that are coming up in these discussions, but now having been part of a few of them, it strikes me today, I guess, more than usual about the disconnect between, I guess, or the gap, I should say, between the science and the delivery. And not that there aren't still, huge scientific challenges here, but like we've got great drugs, we've got great options, and it seems like more the barriers are in still in evidence generation about determining which of those options really, definitively, which is the best, and then getting that to patients early and consistently. Even as we're able to see a couple of, well, I should say a model in a country where it seems to be, quite possible, and we're still struggling with those parts of it.
Thank you. Stephanie Nichols.
Thank you. This was a great session today. As always, I really appreciated learning from everyone here. And Lauren, again, I echo everyone else's comments about how important your participation in particular was to this meeting. I echo what many people have already said, so I'll just say it again, which is I think it's so important that we have financial transparency across the board. We've said this over and over again at these meetings. I am so appreciative that we're having these conversations because I don't think these conversations were happening 10, 15 years ago. So it's really fantastic that this is happening now, and I'm happy to be part of these conversations. So thank you.
Thank you. Jean Ryer.
So I want to thank Lauren and Barry and Annetta and Bruce, because you all added so much to this, and as did our payer and pharmacy friends. I am sitting here in more than the usual stew of hopefulness and abject frustration. Fondly disagreeing with Rob, I don't think I needed another example of how the laws of traditional economics do not work in healthcare. But the idea that prices go up when you have prices of old treatments go up when you have new entrants to the market is just absolutely baffling to me this afternoon, and I really can't process it. So I'm going to end. I think I have quoted Uwe Reinhardt more than once in these sessions, and it's really all about the cost. It's about the price. So until we wrap our heads around that and our collective efforts, I don't really know that we're getting to a better place, and the science is getting us there. The market is defeating the science, in my view, and the patients are the ones at risk.
I think I'm the only one left. I would just say that I would never underestimate the potential of basic and translational science and pharmaceutical development to provide new answers. I'm not even in this field, but I remember how exciting it was when the Tysabri trial came out in 2006. I was a medical student. And so in my mind, the last 15 years, more than 15 years, has had tremendous advances in MS therapy. And in part, that has to do with sort of advances in basic and translational science that have come before. We even have had someone here today who, got the diagnosis at a relatively early age, decided to go into neuroscience. our ability to deal with these awful syndromes and diseases as a scientific and medical community is so vast, but you can really fumble the ball on the 1 yard line if we don't have good alignment of price and coverage. You have to deliver the drugs in a meaningful way for patients to benefit from them. And so no matter how amazing our basic and translational science pharmaceutical development is, we have to have this last step for patients to benefit. It's been a pleasure working with you all today on this. And with that, I will hand it back to Steve with 5 minutes ahead of schedule.
Look at that. Good job, everybody. So thanks again to the Policy Roundtable. My father was a practicing psychiatrist, private practice psychiatrist, and he came home one day and he said, you know, the worst condition I see in my practice, and I guessed schizophrenia. And he said, no, it's multiple sclerosis. He ended up having a lot of patients with bad multiple sclerosis who were having not only neurologic issues, but obviously depression, and just their families were very deeply involved in the debilitating aspects of this disease over many years. And he expressed, I was young, I was before medical school. He just said, it's just horrible. And that was a long time ago. So I'm just going to start again with kind of what Jason said, which was, it's brilliant that we have all these new treatments. There's absolutely no doubt that they have revolutionized the care for these patients. And yet we still need more because they still progress and we still haven't really gotten to anything close to a cure. And then I'll just shift to a sense of appreciation. I mentioned that study or that investigation of the pricing of Aduhelm. And again, the thing is that we all know this happens, but when you see it in black and white, it somehow just hurts a little bit more. The company was quite explicit in how it intended to fund and manipulate patient group opinion as the drug was launched. And I just have to say the NMSS and the breadth of its view of its role in giving voice to the patient concerns and the way that they have included pricing and value as well as access and the need for future innovation really stands as a best practice in the world of patient advocacy. And they have been doing this for a long time and they're still incredibly good at it. And they can't solve the world by themselves. But when you look at the slides that go to the CEO, it says, how will the patient advocates react if we price at this point, at this point, at this point? And I would guess that, ublituximab may have come out at a lower price. And I know Ocrevus was also pitched this way at the time, that their pricing was probably in not a small way moderated by their view of how the patient community would react. And I give full credit to Barry and Lauren and their colleagues for the way that you guys have helped to channel and to give voice to that. So not just thanks to us, thanks from us for your participation in this report, but for your broader work on behalf of patients in the community. I just want to applaud you for that. And then I'll go full Gene Ryer on you here. Great innovation. Vote was 9-1, low value at the current price. We've seen 20 years of failed competition in our healthcare system. As Gene said, prices rising on older drugs when they go generic, and it all trickles down, and even in a more dysfunctional way if patients have to pay more for the generic than they would otherwise. But we have a chance to get it right to a certain extent, a new chance to get it right with the biosimilars. We should have it with the small molecule generics too, but the biosimilars may indeed create a new window of an opportunity to create an arm. And if it can't be as organized as it is at Kaiser, at least the spirit of it can carry through. And there might be some structural ways that we can maximize the availability of less expensive treatments to do the right thing for patients while still supporting brand drug innovation. I think we really can do that with the funding going into multiple sclerosis. So I'll just have a slight silver lining to the feeling that Gene expressed of the years of a failed market, in that I think that with the NMSS's work and with continued attention in this area, biosimilars may be a catalyst that can really get us to a different place when we do a report 6 years from now, and we're looking back at more future innovation. So thank you to the great work of the ICER research staff and to you guys at CEPAC. Again, wonderful job thinking through the evidence, a very complicated report in some ways with all the drugs, the class reviews, network meta-analysis. It asks a lot of you, but you gave it great attention and asked great questions and thought it through. So as always, thank you for your attention to all of that. So thanks to the Policy Roundtable. Last word again for your participation, patient experts and others. And the last slide we have, if they'll put it up, just says that within the next couple of weeks, we will be completing our final report. And that will include a description of the votes and the deliberation and some Policy Roundtable recommendations, if you will. Largely, they kind of create perspectives on the right way forward. But there'll be some pretty, I think, strong statements about the way that things need to change or could be better, best practices that really shouldn't wait. We'll look forward to putting those into our set of recommendations. So thank you to those of you who've watched online as well. And I hope you all enjoy your snowy weekend if you're here in New England or wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, John and Mel. Excellent job.